Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me today to share with you some thoughts about what is happening in the world. We need to say that we are living a lot of transitions at global levels. One of them is the energy transition, and it's related with some of the most compelling challenges we are facing at global level. So let me start with what we are expecting for the future. It is possible that the world population will grow by 20% by the year 2040. That implies we were talking about 9 billion people by 2040, which implies it's equivalent to build one city like New York City every 43 days, or one city like Charlotte every 4 days. So most of those people are going to come to live to the cities, and that is an important challenge. More than that, on the other side, it's expected that the economy will improve and the income per capita will grow by roughly 90%. That's the estimations of the Energy Transition Commission, which I belong as well, which implies a higher demand for more and for better goods and services and higher demand for energy and electricity. We are talking of one of the biggest challenges for the future, which is to provide an increase in the global energy demand, well, it could be between 30% to 50%, depending on the estimations. IEA is estimating 30%, the Commission, Energy Transition Commission is estimating 50%, but definitely there will be huge growing demand for energy. And that implies that according with the current trends, if we estimate that the model and the mix of the sources will be the same, the trend that we will observe is coal will be there, as Madam Chairman was saying a few minutes ago, but it's stable. Actually, it's already stable. Oil will still growing for a long time. This is the business as usual scenario. It's the inertial trend. I need to clarify that. And as she was saying, natural gas will play an incredible role for the future. So that is the inertial trend. However, we are at the same time observing quite dramatic phenomena everywhere, which is climate change. Talking about some of the hurricanes that are hitting recently the United States. 2 years ago, Texas had the costliest natural disaster for the U.S. Somebody's talking about 180 billion in terms of damages for the economy and the society. Recently, a few days ago, well, last year as well, we observed forest fires in California, the worst ever. And everywhere we are observing these extreme weather events. What is happening? This is related with several phenomena, but one in particular is global warming. Is there global warming indeed? Yes, there is one. You can see these bars representing the average increase in temperature per decade. You can see some increase last century, but you will observe that the last 3 decades has been the highest, the hottest decades ever, one after the other. And the same has been by the year 2014, 15, and 16. They were in a row the hottest years on records. Yes, there is global warming. Now, is that related with human activity or not? I know it's a big debate, but I will make just one point. You can observe 1,000 years of two variables: carbon emission concentrations in the atmosphere, and you can see that with some ups and downs related with volcanoes or something like that, we're roughly stable. And you can see the average temperature of the air in the blue line, which has been also quite stable. However, after the Industrial Revolution and this increase in carbon emission due to the Industrial Revolution by cars and factories and so on, carbon emission concentration increased dramatically at global level. And what happened with the average temperature? it increased as well in a very correlated way. So there are a lot of bold evidences that human activity, especially after the Industrial Revolution and global warming, are absolutely correlated. Now, what is happening is this global warming is provoking serious changes in the environment. The weather is changing because most of those events are related with, for instance, the temperature of the sea. If the sea is warmer, it is quite feasible that the hurricanes will be produced faster and in a more violent way. You can see this picture. Basically, there are 3 hurricanes and 1 tropical storms in the Atlantic Sea hitting at the same time the coast of Mexico, the Caribbean, and the United States. So if we analyze those extreme events and try to explore what has happened in history, we can see another correlation. This red line is the increase in average temperature I was talking about. And you will see in the blue line the annual average per decade of extreme weather events. In this particular case, the annual average of storms. At the beginning of the century, it could be like 2 or 3 per decade. But now, you can observe extreme events, storms, above 100 per decade, and in a very similar correlation with the increase in temperature. So storms, extreme events, are correlated in a very important part. Nobody can assure that every single storm is related with that, but roughly we are observing that clear phenomenon. What about floods? This is now here in North Carolina, recently, like 3 weeks ago, with the Hurricane Florence. Floods are also observing the same trend. You see the temperature anomaly in Celsius degrees, and you see the floods as well, annual average per decade, increasing and increasing. What about droughts? This is California, the worst drought ever, it's still like 7 or 8 years. Again, droughts are correlated with increase in temperature. So basically the message is climate change is true. Scientists say that it's related with human activity, with carbon emission concentrations. So, but if the evidence is so clear, why we are not taking strong and bold action? The perception we have in the global commissions on the economy and climate, it is because there is a general perception that tackling climate change, taking environmental action, implies huge economic cost. That it is not possible to provide economic benefits for the people and at the same time to be responsible with the environment. And actually, it's presented for anyone, especially for the leaders in business or politics, that there is a dilemma. We need to pick between economic growth and fighting climate change. Well, after several years of some of the most serious researchers, we arrive at a quite different conclusion. That is a false dilemma. We don't need to choose between economic growth and prosperity and environmental responsibility. It is possible to have better growth and better climate at the same time. It is possible to reduce poverty, and it is possible to reduce carbon emissions at the same time. But in order to do that, we need to take serious decisions right now in a window of opportunity that we are estimating that could be closed by the year 2030. We need to change substantially several big systems, and I will talk a little bit about them. The goal for the future, according with Paris, and recently the IPCC report that was released last week, is to reach a future of 1.5 Celsius degrees. To be realistic is the 2 Celsius degrees, considering the Paris Agreement, roughly could be the guide for humanity. But if we surpass the 1.5 Celsius degrees, a lot of catastrophes will happen. For instance, the death of the coral reefs, including the most beautiful coral reef in the world, which is in the Mexican Caribbean Sea, or in Australia, and other disasters that are already happening. So, coming back, this is the current trend. If we do nothing, the carbon emission will take the global average temperature at the end of the century to an increase of 4.5 Celsius degrees. How much is that? Currently, the increase in the average temperature has been only 0.6 Celsius degrees, less than 1 Celsius degrees. If we do nothing, the air will grow, the temperature will grow to 4.5 Celsius above the average. And you can imagine the size of the catastrophe. It is impossible to measure, it is impossible to give a precise number, but definitely there will be an extreme events more frequent and more violent for anyone. So that's the challenge. After the Paris Agreement and the Paris Convention on Climate Change, a lot of countries established some unilateral commitments, the national determined commitments, in order to reduce carbon emissions. However, even assuming that all those countries are able to keep their word, the global increase in temperature will be roughly 3.5 Celsius degrees. So it is not enough, clearly. What is needed, according with Paris, is to take this part to reduce the carbon emissions in order to reach the 2 Celsius degrees. And that was released last week is, in order to prevent more catastrophes, we need to be harder in terms of carbon emission reduction. But let me go with some projections. How is possible to reach that without sacrificing prosperity for the people? It is possible. That's the message. But in order to do that, in order to get higher quality, more resilient and inclusive growth, we need to change several systems. First, the cities. We cannot continue with this sprawling model of cities, like Mexico City, for instance. Mexico City, for instance, is a clear example of what should not be done in the future. This sprawling model is inhuman, unproductive, polluting, and et cetera, et cetera. So basically the idea is this. We have two different models of cities. And you have here Atlanta, for instance, with roughly 5 million people. And you have Barcelona on the other side with 5 million people as well. You can see, engineers, it's the very same scale. So the graph is exactly the same scale. And the key issue is Barcelona is deployed over 650 square kilometers, and Atlanta is deployed over almost 8,000 square kilometers. So the conclusion of that is, only talking about transportation, the emissions per capita in Atlanta are 10 times the emission per capita in Barcelona. So the system for the future is, we need to change the way in which we are designing the cities. We are expecting 1 billion people more coming to live in the cities in 15 years. We need to think in more compact, connected, and coordinated cities based upon massive transportation system instead of based upon in the use of individual cars. It doesn't mean that the individual cars will disappear, but we need to change the design of the cities more in the massive transportation system. So the second system is land use. It is important to consider that 25% of global emissions are coming either from deforestation or bad practices in the agricultural sector. So we need to stop deforestation in 1.5 decades, and we need to increase the technology in order to produce more food in a more productive way to feed more people. Is that possible to combine? Again, the logic behind the Commission is things that are good for the environment and also are good for the economy. One or two examples. This one, a teak plantations in Mexico. The return of investment is beyond 12% a year. So it's a real business, a real profits, planting trees. And at the same time, these plantations are capturing carbon from the atmosphere, are reverting the process of carbon emission. So it's good for the environment and it's good for the economy. Other example is in Yucatan Peninsula as well. These projects, talking technology from agroforestry systems, are able to improve the quality of the soil, which provide 16% increase in revenues for farmers. And for instance, cattle ranchers are able to grow, multiply by 3 the number of cattle heads for them. Again, good for the environment, good for the pocket. And the third system, of course, we need to change is energy. It doesn't apply to reduce the energy itself. Actually, we need to increase the supply of energy, but in a more rational way and trying to decarbonize the energy system. How that is possible? Well, this is a figure about the carbon emission, depending on what do you want for the future. The 4.5 Celsius degrees is the inertial trend. The 2 Celsius, for instance, or the 1.5. This is the current trend of carbon emission. It is expected that the carbon emissions need to decline by 50% by the year 2040. And on the second part of this century needs to go neutral, zero carbon emission in net terms. That implies, for instance, to switch some of the options in terms of fossil fuel consumption. Fossil fuels, in order to reach these scenarios I was talking about, fossil fuels needs to be reduced in consumption. So this is the inertial trend I was talking about, the business as usual scenario. So basically, consumption needs to decline by 1/3 by the year 2040. That implies to several related matters. One is the advance of technology. One important technology is carbon capture and sequestration. Is it possible to do that with some machines, for instance, to capture the carbon from the atmosphere and reconvert or storage it? It is possible, yes. But currently, there is not enough scale to do that. So depending on the evolution of CCS technology, we will have these kind of trends in terms of fossil fuels consumption, either higher or lower. What about between those sources of fossil fuels? Oil is going to reach a peak next decade and is going to start to decline by the year 2040. Coal definitely will reduce because it's becoming, it's clear that it is the biggest polluting in these fossil fuels. And natural gas, as it was saying, is going to be the most used and the better and the best probably fossil fuels. Actually, either it's a bridge fuels, as it was saying, or it's a transition fuel. The point is, the trend in the global arena will be to reduce fossil fuels and even between fossil fuel sources to reduce carbon emissions. What is happening with carbon? There are already, beyond the debate about climate change and beyond if you believe or not about that, the point is public policy and the global regulation are pushing in order to reduce carbon emission. It's a fact. So 40 countries, for instance, are implementing carbon pricing schemes one way or another, in particular in Europe, cap and trade, or China. Most of the consumers are pressing the utilities and companies in order to reduce the carbon emission sources. The consumers and the investments are pushing in order to low carbon emission as well. Actually, for instance, in Norway's, the National Fund of Norway, which implies roughly $1 trillion of investment, they decided to depart not to invest any single coin in coal investment, for instance. Or here in the United States, Stanford University, doing exactly the same, divesting away from coal assets. Actually, it is estimated, according with Bloomberg, half of global carbon assets are owned by firms which are bankrupt. Half of those. Why? Because carbon is becoming risky business. If you are going to invest $3 billion in a mine or a plant, it has a life period of 50 years, you cannot assure revenues for the future for that. So it could be stranded assets. What is the new normal? Renewables are the new normal. Solar and wind are generating and providing jobs for 4 million people. If you consider the total for sustainable energy, including energy efficiency, we are talking about more than 10 million jobs at global level. And what is happening right now in the United States? Solar and wind are providing, talking only in power generation, almost 500,000 American jobs, compared with fossil fuels in power generation, 150,000, which is 3 times as much, or more than 3 times, jobs in renewables than in fossil fuels in power generation. That's a trend. That's the change. That's the energy transitions and the new economy, which again is good for the environment and is good for the economic growth. Where are the opportunities in renewable? Several fields: in electricity, in transport, in heating. Actually, heating is the most important probably. And technology is working in that side. You can see the cost curve of solar power over time. Definitely 10 years ago, the price of providing 1 megawatt hour of solar energy was roughly $400 megawatt hour. Currently, if you observe the last prices everywhere in Mexico or Chile or Dubai or Abu Dhabi, now the price is $21. So in 10 years, the cost of solar energy went down more than 93%, from $400 to only $21. And the same is happening in wind power coast as well. You can see the same figures in different sizes. Again, it's good for the environment and good for the economy. One more example. What about the consumer? This is the roof of my house, as we the Mexicans say, your house. My wife and myself decided to invest in solar panels in the roof. So you can see, for instance, this is our electricity bill coming down. This is our consumption of energy coming from the grill. And this is the electricity bill from 4,200 pesos to only 180 pesos. So the payback could be in 4 or 5 years for 12 years of the life of those solar panels. So it's real business. We are saving money. We are making business. And we are helping the planet. This is the same logic of the new climate economy, as we say. Well, what about the electric vehicles? It's a big question mark everywhere. But the point is, technology and companies are investing a lot in the new technology of electric vehicles. And the current trend expected by most of these scenarios is by the year 2040, there will be 23% of electric vehicles in the street, 1 out of 4. But if technology improves again, and that is quite possible, you can see that what happened with cell phones, no? 30 years ago, there was like a big cell phone. It was impossible to carry on or to buy it. And now technology went beyond that anyone was expecting at that time. The same is going to happen, in my opinion, with electric vehicles. Depending on several factors, either the cost of the batteries, the capacity of the batteries, the charging infrastructure, if it's possible to charge your vehicle everywhere or not, the speed of the charging process. All those factors are playing and could reach the electric vehicles to even 3 times as expected today. Other point, again, regardless your own opinion or the government opinion about climate change, the point is the regulations in the world is already changing. That is the trend. The policies are encouraging the transition. In California, the goal is to have 1.5 million electric vehicles by the year 2025. France and the UK, they are banning fossil fuel cars with diesel or gasoline will be banned by the year 2040, completely forbidden. Norway is doing the same, but by the year 2025, no more cars coming from oil, to say that. China, expecting electric vehicles were 1/5 of the total circulation cars. India, the same goals. What is the part of electricity, for instance? Electricity as a share of the total energy consumption will increase, definitely. Not as much as I was expecting, but it's going to pass from 23% of the total consumption to 27%. The key issue for electricity will be transportation. If electric vehicles jump into transportation, that would be a real change beyond these numbers I'm presenting today. What about renewables as a share of the total power consumption? Currently, roughly 25% at global level. It's expected to be by 2023, 30%, 44% by the year 2040. So roughly half of the total power consumption will come from renewables very soon. I was saying that in heating is probably the most important thing because transportation and heating is the largest end users of renewables in absolute terms right now. And renewable electricity expanding for buildings, it's a quite amazing business opportunity. One example, this is a research made by Wharton of UPenn. It's about retrofitting buildings. So these nice buildings, for instance, just changing, for instance, the windows, putting some kind of sensors, smart sensor related with air conditioning, or changing the air conditioning, etc. It is possible to make serious businesses there. Globally, buildings and constructions are responsible for 60% of electricity use in the world. In the United States, retrofitting industry implies an opportunity of $1 trillion of investment. $1 trillion of investment in the next 10 years, and it is potentially able to create 3.3 million American jobs in the future. In Philadelphia, where is Wharton School established, they are estimating $1 billion potential of investment. And what about the consumers? What about the people? The owner of one building or one apartment will see in all those places that retrofitting has already happened, they are seeing an increase of 6% in the rent of the house, of the apartment, and 15% of the price of the house, the real estate. Again, it's good for the environment, reducing carbon emissions in the building, and good for the pocket. There are several factors that could accelerate the transition. One, we need to stop subsidizing fossil fuels. Globally, there are $400 billion a year going to pollute the atmosphere. We need to stop fossil fuel subsidies, which is an incredible potential. We can use that money for different things. We must invest in clean energy. You can see the wind farm, for instance, the first I established in Mexico, in La Ventosa, less than 1 megawatt. And then the current now at global level with 8 megawatts of capacity. Now, what is going to be established in the North Sea in Denmark are these kind of poles. No? So only the blade will be 92 meters long, 92 meters, no? Bigger than a soccer field, only the blade. And the pole with the blade will be higher than Eiffel Tower in Paris. That is already happening. So the choice is ours. Either we continue to invest in this polluting trend, either in energy on cities, you can imagine this kind. That is not a solution. We cannot invest in cars, more cars, and cars, and cars, and cars, because that is exactly the wrong way we need to avoid. So the low carbon economy is a reality. There is a common sense that you need to reduce your economic growth, you want to be responsible. That is not true. The world already is decoupling economic growth from carbon emission. That is happening in Sweden, in the UK, it's happening in California, it's happening in the States, it's happening in Denmark. For instance, 38% of growth, 25% less emissions. It's happening in Ontario, it's happening in British Columbia. European Union, for instance, the GDP grew 53% and the emissions were reduced by 23%. You can see that data everywhere in which you can observe the economic growth happening at the same time reducing carbon emissions. That is the goal of the new climate economy. Some countries have serious commitment. I will finish my presentation due to time. But the point is, companies are leading the way. Companies are establishing transition to renewable energy as a commitment of the company. And the OECD demonstrated in a recent research that actually with low carbon economy, countries belonging to the G20 group could grow even faster than the current trend. I will skip these numbers, it's a little bit complicated. So the final message. We can turn the greatest global challenge of our time in a great opportunity, the opportunity of a lifetime, by reducing carbon emission and jumping into the new climate low carbon economy. We can do well by doing good. Thank you very much.